Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to another Tuesday talk show. Happy Halloween everybody, came out just in time. So today I want to talk a little bit about horror and all the sort of stuff about that. So horror is actually one of those genres that I kind of really like and kind of dislike at the same time. It's really frustrating at times and it's always got sort of this one weakness to it. And that is the one that I'm currently struggling with where I'm writing here, in that the ending of virtually every horror story is kind of lame, in all honesty. I haven't found very many that I really liked. Out of all the horror sort of games that I've played, actually some of the best are things like Silent Hill, where there's just so much interpretability in the various different endings, and there's so much going on in all the different ones that sort of reflects how you played. That always is something that I quite like. And this is one of the best parts about video games, is the fact that you can have those sort of multiple endings. For a singular sort of ending video game, though, I would have to say that my favorite ending so far is the one from Soma, just because of how much more interesting the sort of existential questions become at the very, very ending there, and sort of just how terrible it is for the main character, where he just finds himself in that situation where he's completely alone. Might not even be able to kill himself or die, where he is just slowly draining himself of batteries or whatever at the bottom of the ocean, where there's literally no one else to be with, his only companion having short-circuited just a short time ago, while his other self is living up on a platform that he can't appreciate. And yeah, that ending was also quite strong, just because of how good the lead-up towards that being the case was. But in the vast majority of cases where the monster or some sort of supernatural force is supposed to be what's supposed to scare you, you'll notice that in neither of those games, it's not the supernatural elements that are really supposed to get to you. It's sort of the psychological elements that are ultimately supposed to sort of scare you and terrify you, or bring you to a sort of sense of unease, as it were. But we're going to be talking about the other type of video game there, the one where it's just throwing jump scares at you. Now, one of my other favorite horror games that I haven't really played with you guys is actually the Fear franchise, and in particular the first one. The second one was also pretty okay. The third one, it stopped being any sort of pretense of a horror game. But the first two games were quite fantastic, and I actually really like them. One thing about them, though, is that both of them are very, very jump scare heavy, and in sort of the tradition of my Tuesday talk shows where I'm talking about some form of medium and how it sort of approaches things, I'm going to be an apologist for a very unpopular style of idea there, and that is that I think that jump scares do belong in horror games, and that a lot of the sort of more elitist opinions of just jump scares are horrible, they shouldn't, and all these sort of other opinions that you sort of hear about them from time to time, or that a game's just full of jump scares and people talk about that as well. I don't particularly think that this is a useful critique or a intelligible critique of this sort of genre. Now, I started off by talking about sort of this very sort of existential kind of sense of dread there, and this is more of a modern-ish thing. I don't think that horror has actually been about that for very long. Of course, there's been stories that have revolved around this for a long time, but we wouldn't have classified them necessarily as horror, necessarily. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that this is actually a less natural state for horror to be in. To me, horror is supposed to be something that elicits a sense of fear in people, and people have sort of been trying to get away from that idea a little bit, because it sort of allows them to excuse themselves when they say that jump scares are bad, or that that's not a good part of horror games. The reality is that fear is a very base instinctual reaction in humanity, and we have it because people who didn't experience fear got killed. And this is talking like way, way, way back in our history, and I don't even think that there were ever humans for very long or at all that didn't have that sense of fear. Our ancestors that were not human, what we came from, those things sensed fear. Those things had a physiological, basic reaction to very simple external stimuli, and that basically was, there's something, it's going to kill me, I need to act fast. And what we get is this huge rush of adrenaline. It gets us immediately jacked up and ready to do something. We would either be able to run faster, or we'd be able to run longer, or we'd be able to fight harder than we ever would be able to if we didn't have that surge of adrenaline going through us, if we didn't have that sort of reaction that we are in danger and we need to act now. And that's the fear reaction. That is what we were designed to feel when we are exposed to danger. So what does this come back to? Well, interestingly enough, I don't find that these newer forms of horror instill very much adrenaline, and they don't really sort of elicit this very basic fear response in people. It just sort of makes you uncomfortable, and this is a very different sensation than, I would say, a sensation of horror. At the same time, however, there's sort of an interplay between these concepts and these ideas, because that sort of unease and that disquieted feeling and that sort of sense of discomfort is something that actually primes us and prepares us for the idea that we're going to be in danger soon. It sort of makes us expect it, and it sort of gets us prepared with a small dose of sort of adrenaline or whatever before then. But if you were to play an entire game that sort of went the entire way without ever sort of having any sort of actual scary thing out to get you in any sort of capacity throughout the entire experience, what would happen is you'd sort of have this sort of disquieted sense of unease throughout a long while, and then you'd feel comfortable in it. And this is because people are actually quite adaptable, and once they realize that there's nothing that's going to kill them, and it might take them like an hour of playing, it might take them 10 minutes of playing, it might take them half an hour of playing, it might vary from person to person, but once they get into that sort of state of feeling at ease, it stops being a horror game, and it just sort of starts being a very peculiar game where you got this sort of strange setting and atmosphere that's sort of giving you a kind of an uneasy feeling, but still one that you might feel perfectly at home with if you take enough time with it. An example of this would be Don't Starve, which has a very disquieting atmosphere and a very disquieting aesthetic and sort of unnatural way of things. And it actually kind of has a feel like a horror game at certain parts of it. But once you sort of get adapted to the game and you play it enough, you don't really feel as though any of the individual parts of it are really that scary. And the same goes for a game like Resident Evil. Resident Evil 4 is not a particularly scary game, but once you get adapted to it, it becomes a completely not scary game. If you played it enough, I used to do all knife runs in Resident Evil 4 because it was a fun game and the mechanics of it are actually really solid, and it's actually kind of challenging and interesting to do stuff like that. But at the same time, like, it started off actually quite creepy at certain parts, and I actually think that the game is pretty good at presenting a few moments that are quite intense. But you get used to it really, really quickly because there's really no fear of actually getting killed at any point in that game. You get used to the mechanics, you get used to the shooting, you get used to the combat, and you really don't feel as though you're under threat at any given point in time. So all these sort of games have this sort of dynamic of having both the sort of atmosphere and the sort of discomfiture, but I think it also needs that sort of more basal payoff that sort of just surges you with adrenaline and gets you pumped up and ready to do something, whether it be to run away like a coward or to fight back. A lot of games sort of make this an artificial thing in that they make it so you can't fight back by making you sort of completely powerless. I actually find that this sort of draws me out of the game a little bit depending on the context, but it varies from person to person, and I think from game to game as well to a certain degree. But what I'm essentially getting at here is that games require you to have some degree of feeling as though you're under threat, whether it be from a protracted chase sequence, whether it be from a really intense boss fight, or whether it be from something else like a jump scare. All those different elements can throw you out of that comfort zone and make you remember that you're in a sort of setting where you're potentially in danger. The opposite is also true, though. If you've got sort of a game where it just has nothing and then suddenly there's a jump scare, you'll get that spike of adrenaline, but you'll come down really quickly. And you'll sort of get back to a basal state very, very quickly, or you might, for a little while expect maybe another one's going to come up and you're going to be flinching and hoping that that doesn't happen. But ultimately, you're not going to be that scared from that experience either. And the reason is that when we experience a video game, we're experiencing a sense that we might be in danger from a sort of distant perspective. We know that we're not actually in any danger. We know that we're safe when we play these games. So when there's a big jump scare, it startles us, but we realize pretty quickly that we're not actually in any sort of threats there. Nothing is really going to hurt us, and that nothing is really dangerous to us. And this is where the other elements of horror come in. This is where the element of that sort of slower atmospheric draw, that sort of more psychological element, does come into play. But you'll notice that these both work best when they're synergizing off of each other, when the atmosphere and tone and sort of psychology of the game draws you into the experience and makes it so that you feel as though you're there personally, or that you personally sympathize or empathize with the character enough that you feel fear for their safety. Either of those is going to draw you into the world enough that when those scares hit you, they're going to be a lot more intense, and they're going to be a lot more long-lasting, and they're going to stay scary for a lot longer. So generally speaking, I think that a lot of the people who sort of offhand dismiss jump scares, to be fair, most of them are not talking about all jump scares ever. They're talking about things that have just a jump scare and there's no build up or lead up or climax to it. It's just there. And that's perfectly fine to criticize that. But I think at the same time, those people never really talk necessarily about the antithesis to that, where it's just all sort of psychological or existential horror. I don't think that that really works either personally, because I find that I get comfortable really quickly with it. This also might be why I don't find Call of Cthulhu books scary, though, and some people might. I find myself getting very used to what's being described in there very quickly. And maybe it's just because I'm particularly adaptable. Maybe it's because I'm insane. I don't really know for sure which of those is the truth. But in any event, you know, if there's no sort of scare to it, no sort of sense that I might actually be harmed from something, I really don't actually care that something is incomprehensibly more powerful or beyond my complete imagining, because, well, there's lots of things that are completely beyond my imagining. I'm not that creative. And so when you show me one of those, I'm just going to be like, okay, well, I mean, now I can imagine it because I've seen it. So, you know, might just be because I'm a fairly jaded person, but I think that more modern people are like that as well, just where they can be exposed to that sort of atmosphere and that sort of sense of things and feel as though it's something that they could conceive of, whereas perhaps they couldn't have back in the 1800s. I think that as well, people have sort of come to the understanding that things that, you know, aren't familiar to us, we're just a lot more used to being surrounded by things that we're not familiar with. But in any event, that's my sort of little talk about horror there. It's just going to be about jump scares, basically. I think that they're, to a certain degree, overused, sure, but I think they're also underrated. When used properly, I think that they are an essential sort of part of the horror diet there, where something sudden happens, it gives you that sort of spike there. And there are plenty of times where, you know, the monster or whatever just sort of gradually shows up or whatever. Silent Hill is a classic example of a horror game that does a fantastic job of not having to use jump scares, where the monsters are all just blatantly there. They don't pop out of corners or anything like that. It's just right in front of you, and it's very discomforting when they sort of approach you, because it's just as much danger as it would be if you had something suddenly jump out at you out of nowhere. But it's at the same time slightly different. It's just that you, in either of those cases, you need to feel as though your life's potentially in danger. So in any event, I hope you guys have a happy Halloween, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.